Yellowstone National Park is often sold as a place of wonder, a vast stretch of untouched wilderness where geysers erupt on schedule, bison roam freely, and the ground itself seems alive. But beneath that beauty is something far less forgiving. Yellowstone is also one of the most dangerous national parks on Earth, a place where people have been crushed by falling trees, dragged by wildlife, swept away by rivers, and lost to sudden weather. In fact, the park's long history of fatal accidents is so extensive that it's been documented in a dedicated book, Death in Yellowstone, a chilling record of how nature repeatedly reminds visitors who's really in control. Yet among all these dangers, one stands apart: the Yellowstone's hot springs. Unlike wild animals, they don't warn you when you're too close. They steam gently, painted in surreal colors that look almost inviting, while water hot enough to destroy the human body hides just inches below, a fragile crust. Over the years, people of all ages, from curious children to seasoned travelers, have taken one wrong step, slipped at the wrong moment, or trusted ground that was never solid to begin with. Some died instantly. Others survived long enough to realize the mistake they'd made. A few lived just long enough to tell their story. And in rare cases, their names became part of Yellowstone itself. This is not a story about every disaster Yellowstone has seen. This is a story about the springs, the boiling pools, the hidden heat beneath the surface, and the people who got too close in one of the most beautiful and most unforgiving places on Earth, Yellowstone National Park. On June 7, 2016, 23-year-old Colin Scott, a recent graduate from Portland, Oregon, ventured into the heart of Yellowstone National Park with his sister, Sable, eager to explore its natural wonders. The day was supposed to be an adventure, a celebration of his academic achievements before the next chapter of his life. Like many others who visit this famous park, Colin and Sable were drawn to the geothermal features that make Yellowstone world-renowned, its hot springs, geysers, and boiling mud pots. But little did they know their curiosity would lead them to a tragic fate that would make headlines across the world. The siblings arrived at the Norris Geyser Basin, an area known for its geothermal volatility. It was a place that, despite its beauty, held one of the park's most dangerous secrets: the geothermal pools that could reach temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit, capable of melting skin and dissolving tissue in seconds. But despite the park's safety signs and warnings, Colin and Sable wandered off the designated boardwalk, stepping into areas where visitors were strictly advised not to go. They were searching for a place to hot pot, a practice of soaking in a hot spring, something that had been attempted by others in the past, but is both dangerous and illegal. As they ventured deeper into the thermal areas, Colin was drawn to a particular pool, its surface shimmering with the intense heat of the boiling water beneath. The temperature of the pool was scorching, a dangerous heat that should have warned any cautious observer to stay away. As they stood at the edge, Colin, perhaps too eager to immerse himself in the natural wonder before him, bent over to check the water, unaware of the unstable ground beneath his feet. Without warning, the ground gave way, and Colin fell into the boiling hot spring, his body submerged in the acidic water. His screams were drowned out by the sounds of Yellowstone's volatile landscape. Sable, in panic, rushed to his side, trying desperately to help him. But the intense heat made it impossible for her to pull him out. At that moment, the sisters' attempts were in vain. She could only watch in horror as Colin was consumed by the water, the severe burns too intense for any real hope of survival. Realizing she couldn't save him, Sable ran to the nearest ranger station to alert officials, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. The rescue team faced another heartbreaking truth. Because of the extreme heat, Colin's body had been rapidly dissolved by the acidic water, leaving only traces of what remained. His personal items, such as a wallet and flip-flops, recovered from the thermal pool. The official cause of death was confirmed as scalding due to submersion in thermal hot spring, a chilling reminder of the park's inherent dangers. But Colin Scott wasn't the first to fall victim to Yellowstone's thermal dangers. Almost a century earlier, in 1890, another life was claimed by the park's scorching heat. James Joseph Stumbo, whose death marked the first recorded fatality from a hot spring incident in Yellowstone's history. In 1890, Yellowstone National Park was still a young and largely unexplored area, brimming with natural beauty but also dangers that many visitors couldn't yet understand. It was a time when the park's geothermal features were still a mystery to most, and the warning signs that now protect tourists were yet to be put in place. James Joseph Stumbo, just a young boy at the age of 7, found himself in the midst of that dangerous wonderland, unaware of the peril that would claim his life. James was visiting the park with his family, full of curiosity and excitement as they explored the geothermal wonders that made Yellowstone famous. The family had wandered off the trails in search of adventure, not knowing how close they were to one of the most deadly features of the park, its thermal pools. Hot springs with their vibrant colors and steamy surfaces looked inviting to a young child, but beneath the seemingly calm waters lay a searing danger. It wasn't long before tragedy struck. James, probably drawn by the allure of the bubbling water, wandered too close to a hot spring. He didn't know the ground around it was fragile, hiding dangerous boiling waters just beneath the surface. As he ventured too far, the ground gave way, and in an instant, he fell into the scalding hot spring. The temperatures in Yellowstone's geothermal pools can reach over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, a heat so intense that it can cause fatal burns in seconds. His family, horrified by the sight, rushed to help, but they were powerless against the boiling waters. The park, still new and without the safety measures we now take for granted, offered little to protect the visitors from the park's natural dangers. By the time anyone could react, it was too late. The extreme heat and acidity of the thermal waters had already done their damage, and James's life was tragically cut short. The incident was one of the first of its kind in Yellowstone, a stark reminder of the park's unpredictable power. James Joseph Stumbo became the first recorded victim of a hot spring fatality in the park, marking the beginning of a long history of thermal accidents that would follow. From the thermal pools of Yellowstone to the boiling hot springs of the Norris Geyser Basin, we see how history continues to repeat itself. And just a few decades later, in 1981, another life would be claimed in a similarly horrific manner. This time, that of David Allen Kerwin, whose attempt to rescue a dog from a hot spring would end in tragedy. But before we continue, please like and subscribe. Let us know where you're watching from, and if you visited Yellowstone Park before, and what was your experience. On July 20th, 1981, David Allen Kerwin, a 24-year-old man from California, found himself in the middle of a life-and-death situation in Yellowstone National Park. Along with his friend Ronald Ratliff and Ratliff's dog Muzi, David was exploring the park's famous geothermal area, drawn to the beauty of its hot springs and the promise of adventure. But as they wandered near the Celestine Pool, one of Yellowstone's most dangerous thermal features, their peaceful outing would take a sudden and tragic turn. It all began when Muzi, the dog, ran off toward the pool. The playful animal, perhaps curious about the steamy surface of the water, jumped straight into the pool, yelping in distress as it struggled. The temperature of the pool was close to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause severe burns in an instant. David, seeing his dog in trouble, didn't hesitate for a second. Without a moment's thought, he declared, "Like hell I won't," and ran toward the water, despite the warnings of bystanders who urged him to stay away. They knew the danger, but David was determined to save his pet. As David dove headfirst into the scalding water to reach Muzi, the boiling pool consumed him almost instantly. His body was submerged in the scorching heat, and within moments, his skin began to blister, the pain too immense to comprehend. But David didn't give up. He reached for Muzi, pushing the dog back toward the edge of the pool, but it was already too late. His skin was being burned away, and his vision blurred from the heat. It wasn't until David was struggling to stay afloat that Ronald, realizing the severity of the situation, rushed to help. He and another witness managed to pull David from the pool, but it was a desperate attempt to save him from an injury that was already too far gone. David was severely burned, his skin peeling off in sheets. Eyewitnesses reported hearing him say, "That was stupid. How bad am I? That was a stupid thing I did." His body was covered in third-degree burns, and the toll the heat had taken on him was unimaginable. Even his eyes had been scorched, leaving him blind. Despite efforts to get him medical help, David's injuries were so severe that there was little hope of survival. He was rushed to the nearest hospital and later transferred to Salt Lake City, but the burns were so extensive, covering nearly 100% of his body, that it was clear his fate was sealed. The following morning, David Kerwin succumbed to his injuries, leaving behind a heartbreaking story of heroism gone tragically wrong. David's death stands as one of the most emotionally charged tragedies in Yellowstone's history, not only because of the extreme nature of the thermal burns, but also because he was driven by a selfless act. In the summer of 1919, 4-year-old James Baxter Hughes was visiting Yellowstone National Park with his family, unaware that his curiosity about the park's geothermal wonders would lead to a tragic end. The park, still relatively young and less regulated, was a wild and beautiful place, drawing families from across the country. For James and his family, it was supposed to be a day of adventure and discovery, but it would soon become a day of loss. On July 8th, the Hughes family made their way to the West Thumb Geyser Basin, a place famous for its striking thermal pools and hot springs that rimmed the edges of Yellowstone Lake. But while the area was beautiful, its geothermal features were anything but forgiving. The hot springs in this part of the park were deceptively calm at the surface, hiding the deadly boiling water just below. James, like any curious child, was drawn to the shimmering water. His parents, perhaps distracted by the beauty around them, were not fully aware of how close he had gotten to one of the thermal pools. In a moment of unguarded curiosity, James backed into one of the hot springs, the water instantly searing into his small body. His family, horrified, rushed to him, but it was too late. The boiling water had already caused severe burns that would prove to be fatal. As the moments passed, James's family tried to act quickly, but they were far from medical help, and the pain from his injuries was overwhelming. The young boy, burned and suffering, was rushed to the Old Faithful Inn, where the family sought whatever aid they could find. However, the burns were too severe, and James died the next day, succumbing to the shock caused by his injuries. His tragic fate was one of the first recorded fatalities in Yellowstone caused by thermal burns. In the summer of 1970, the Hecht family, like so many other families visiting Yellowstone National Park, sought a memorable vacation among the park's natural wonders. The day was bright and full of promise as they wandered through the upper geyser basin, marveling at the famous geysers and hot springs that made Yellowstone so unique. But the beauty of the park hid a dangerous secret, one that would claim the life of 9-year-old Andrew Clark Hecht, changing his family's life forever. The Hecht family stopped near Crested Pool, a picturesque hot spring near Old Faithful, whose vivid blue water steamed in the crisp mountain air. Crested Pool, like many of Yellowstone's geothermal features, was deceptively calm and inviting. Its striking color and warm mist made it seem like a serene spot, but beneath its surface, the water was a deadly 200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause immediate and catastrophic burns. The family stood nearby, admiring the view, unaware of how quickly things would spiral out of control. As they walked along the path, Andrew, full of curiosity and excitement, began to venture closer to the edge of the pool. Like many children, he was drawn to the water, eager to explore this natural wonder up close. But the ground surrounding the thermal pools in Yellowstone is notoriously unstable. The thin crust over the boiling water can collapse with little warning, and that's exactly what happened. Without any warning, Andrew stepped off the boardwalk, his foot slipping on the fragile crust as he fell into the scalding water of Crested Pool. The heat was so intense that it immediately burned his skin, and within moments he was submerged in the pool. The family's frantic attempts to save him were in vain. The water was far too hot for anyone to safely approach, and by the time Andrew's father could reach him, it was already too late. Witnesses described a moment of horror, watching as the boy's body was quickly overwhelmed by the searing temperatures. Despite the family's efforts to help, there was nothing they could do. By the time help arrived, Andrew's body was severely burned, and he would not survive the ordeal. His family rushed him to Old Faithful Inn, hoping that perhaps there was a chance for recovery, but the injuries were too severe. His small body had absorbed so much of the heat from the boiling water that just hours later he succumbed to the burns and the shock caused by his injuries. The incident left the Hecht family devastated, with nothing but memories of a young life cut tragically short. At the time, Yellowstone had minimal safety infrastructure. No guardrails around the hot springs, no clear warning signs to deter visitors from stepping too close, and no boardwalks to keep people at a safe distance from the geothermal features. In the wake of his death, Andrew's family began a campaign to push for greater public safety awareness in national parks, particularly Yellowstone. They argued that the park needed more extensive safety measures to prevent future accidents like the one that claimed their son's life. Their advocacy led to improvements in the park's infrastructure. Boardwalks and barriers were built around dangerous geothermal features, and warning signs were placed more prominently to ensure visitors understood the risks. But his story didn't end with his death. In honor of his memory, the Andrew Clark Hecht Memorial Public Safety Achievement Award was established, recognizing individuals or groups who made significant contributions to public safety within the national park system. But despite these changes, tragedies have continued into recent years. In the summer of 2022, 70-year-old Il-hun Rowe from Los Angeles, California, traveled to Yellowstone National Park, drawn by the park's stunning natural beauty and famous geothermal features. Little did he know that the trip would end in a way no one could have predicted. On July 31st, Il-hun Rowe wandered near Abyss Pool, one of Yellowstone's deepest and most dangerous hot springs, located in the park's West Thumb Geyser Basin. Like many visitors to Yellowstone, Rowe likely didn't realize just how dangerous the thermal features could be, despite the warnings posted around the park. Abyss Pool is known for its brilliant blue water, which shimmers in the sunlight, inviting visitors to gaze at its beauty. But the water is not just scalding, it's also highly acidic, capable of dissolving organic tissue almost immediately upon contact. Despite its outwardly peaceful appearance, the pool is as dangerous as it is beautiful. What happened to Il-hun Rowe on that fateful day remains a mystery. No one saw him fall into the pool, and the circumstances leading up to his death are unknown. His foot, still in a shoe, was discovered floating in Abyss Pool several weeks later. The discovery was made by a park employee on August 16, 2022, when they noticed a human foot inside a shoe drifting on the surface of the hot spring. The authorities quickly launched an investigation, but there was no evidence to explain how Rowe ended up in the pool. It was later determined through DNA analysis that the remains belonged to Il-hun Rowe. His family was notified, and the painful truth began to unfold. Despite the lack of witnesses and the absence of any significant remains, the Park Service and investigators concluded that Rowe had most likely fallen into the hot spring, either by accident or while exploring an area near the edge of the pool. However, there was no definitive evidence to confirm the exact sequence of events. The authorities ruled out foul play, and though the exact details may never be fully known, the death of Il-hun Rowe served as a sobering reminder of the dangers Yellowstone's thermal features pose to visitors. But when you look closely at Yellowstone's official thermal death records, one detail stands out. Among decades of tragedies dominated by men and children, only one adult woman appears by name. In 1905, that woman was Fanny Weeks, and her final moments near a Yellowstone hot spring would secure her a haunting place in the park's history. In the summer of 1905, Fanny Weeks arrived at Yellowstone National Park as part of a growing wave of early tourists drawn to the park's strange beauty and otherworldly geysers. She was a visitor from Washington, D.C., traveling at a time when Yellowstone was still raw and largely unguarded, when tourists moved through geyser basins by stagecoach and curiosity often replaced caution. On the day of the accident, Fanny was touring the Old Faithful area, walking among steaming vents and boiling pools that hissed and bubbled just feet away from where visitors stood. There were no guardrails, no modern boardwalks guiding every step, and no clear boundaries separating safe ground from lethal water. Like many visitors before and after her, she stood close to the edge, captivated by the sight and sound of the geothermal activity. Accounts suggest she stepped backward, possibly distracted for just a moment, and that single misstep was enough. She slipped into a nearby hot spring, the boiling water instantly inflicting catastrophic burns. Panic followed. Fellow tourists and the stage driver rushed to help her, pulling her from the scalding pool as quickly as they could, but the damage had already been done. The water had burned deep into her skin, injuries so severe that survival was uncertain from the start. She was removed from the park and taken to Livingston, Montana, where she was lodged and placed under care. For weeks she lingered, suffering from the effects of the burns, her condition fluctuating as doctors did what little they could with the medical knowledge and resources of the time. Despite those efforts, Fanny Weeks never recovered. On September 4, 1905, nearly 3 weeks after the accident, she died in Livingston from complications caused by the thermal burns. Her death was reported in newspapers as the result of falling into a boiling spring in Yellowstone National Park, a stark and unsettling headline that traveled far beyond Montana. Her body was later returned to Washington, D.C., where she was laid to rest, far from the place that had claimed her life. What made Fanny Weeks' death stand out, even then, was how unusual it was. Among the early recorded thermal fatalities in Yellowstone, she was the only adult woman whose name appeared in official accounts. In August of 1927, Rollo Gallagher arrived at Yellowstone National Park at a time when the park still felt wild, open, and deceptively accessible. He was traveling through the lower geyser basin near Firehole Lake, an area dotted with steaming pools and thin mineral crusts that looked solid but hid boiling water just beneath the surface. That day, Rollo moved away from the safer, more established paths, stepping onto ground that appeared stable but wasn't. The crust beneath him suddenly gave way, and in an instant he plunged into a hot spring. The water was searing, hot enough to cause devastating burns immediately, and although he managed to get out, the injuries he sustained were severe. Unlike some victims who died instantly, Rollo survived the initial fall, and that brief survival gave him something few others had: time and a choice. Park staff urged him to seek immediate medical treatment, reportedly advising him to go to a hospital within the park system. But Rollo made a different decision. Instead of getting help as quickly as possible, he chose to leave Yellowstone and drive back to Salt Lake City, believing perhaps that he could make it home or that the injuries were survivable with time. So he began the long journey, carrying burns that were already working against him. As the hours passed, his condition worsened. Thermal burns are unlike ordinary injuries, and the damage continues long after the initial contact. By the time Rollo reached Salt Lake City, his body had endured far more than it could handle. He died shortly after arriving, not at the edge of the hot spring, but far from the place where the accident happened, making his story one of the most haunting in Yellowstone's history. And as tragic as his story was, it would soon be echoed by others, because only 2 years later, another visitor would fall into a hot spring near the same basin. And that time, the victim would be a man whose name would become permanently tied to the pool itself, George Landoy. In July of 1929, George Landoy arrived at Yellowstone National Park as part of an international tour meant to celebrate peace, culture, and cooperation. He was a respected Belgian newspaper editor from Antwerp, traveling across the United States with a group of European journalists invited to see the country's most famous landmarks. Yellowstone was supposed to be one of the highlights of the journey, a place of wonder where geysers erupted on schedule and steaming pools dotted the landscape like something from another planet. On the afternoon of July 3rd, Landoi was in the upper geyser basin, moving briskly through the area near Old Faithful as geysers erupted and steam drifted across the boardwalks. The basin was busy and the ground was damp and slick in places, coated with mineral deposits left behind by constant geothermal activity. Landoi walked ahead of part of his group, focused on catching a better view of the geysers nearby, but in his haste he lost his footing. He slipped, and in a split second he fell into a nearby hot spring. The water was brutally hot, far beyond what the human body could tolerate. Landoi managed to pull himself out, but the damage was immediate and severe. Fellow visitors rushed to his aid and he was quickly taken to the Old Faithful area where he received first aid. At first, there was hope that he might survive. He was conscious and doctors did what they could with the medical knowledge and resources available at the time. But thermal burns are deceptive, and while he had escaped the pool, the heat had already caused catastrophic internal damage. Over the next 2 days, Landoi's condition worsened. Despite medical care, his body began to fail under the strain of his injuries. On July 5, 1929, just 2 days after the fall, George Landoi died from complications caused by the burns. News of his death traveled quickly, not just across the United States, but back to Europe, where newspapers reported that a prominent Belgian journalist had died after an accident in America's most famous national park. What made Landoi's death especially haunting was what followed. The hot spring he fell into was later named Belgian Pool, a permanent mark on the landscape that tied his identity to the place where he lost his life. Unlike many other victims whose stories faded quietly into park records, Landoi's name became part of Yellowstone itself, a rare and somber reminder etched directly into the map. And nearly a century later, in 2025, Yellowstone proved it hasn't changed. No fatality this time, but a brutal burn that showed the heat beneath the ground is still just as ready to claim the next mistake. In the summer of 2025, Yellowstone National Park delivered a reminder that felt uncomfortably familiar. This time, no name would be added to the list of the dead, but the warning came close enough to make people stop and look again. A 17-year-old hiker had set out near Lone Star Geyser, a quieter trail just a few miles from Old Faithful, drawn by the promise of space, solitude, and one of Yellowstone's most reliable eruptions. Unlike the crowded boardwalks elsewhere in the park, this area felt open and calm, but that calm was deceptive. As the teenager moved through the geothermal landscape, the ground looked solid, dry, and safe, but Yellowstone has never been honest about what lies beneath its surface. Without warning, the thin thermal crust collapsed, and his foot dropped straight into scalding water, hidden just inches below. The heat was instant and overwhelming, and pain followed immediately. He managed to pull himself free, but the damage was already done. Thermal burns don't behave like ordinary injuries, and even brief contact can cause deep, severe damage that continues long after the moment passes. Emergency responders were called quickly and park officials rushed to the scene. The teenager was treated on site before being transported to a hospital, suffering significant burns to his foot and ankle. He survived, but the injuries were serious enough to draw national attention, not because they were unprecedented, but because they echoed so many incidents that had come before. The National Park Service later confirmed that this was the first recorded thermal injury of 2025, and they emphasized that the area around Lone Star Geyser has limited protective infrastructure, making the ground especially unpredictable. What made the 2025 incident unsettling was not just how it happened, but how little had changed. The same fragile crust, the same hidden heat, the same moment where curiosity or a single step placed someone inches from disaster. This time, the outcome stopped short of death, but the margin is razor thin. Park officials reiterated their warnings, urging visitors to stay on trails, respect closures, and remember that Yellowstone's beauty often disguises lethal danger. The teenager recovered, but the incident stood as the most recent chapter in a long and unbroken pattern. So, let us know what you think about this park in the comment section. Would you still be visiting? Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.